What's up, Gear Mortals? Trey Xavier here, and on today's edition of Gear Gods Quality Control, we're going to be taking a look at the bias rack amp modeler from Positive Grid. The bias rack is essentially a dedicated amp and cab sim modeler. You can swap out a ton of stuff that other amp modelers don't even take into consideration, and that allows you to dial in your amp sound a lot closer to the real thing. The front panel simplicity of the bias rack also adds to its sort of unique charm in that it doesn't have an LED screen or any kind of visual indicators other than the knobs that are on there, just like a real amp. You can pull the rack right out of the box, plop it down on top of your cab, and dial in sounds right on the front face and get a whole huge slew of different sounds out of just the presets and the stuff that you can tweak on the front face of the amp. Now, if you want to get a little more in-depth in your editing and use either the bias amp software for the tablet or for your PC or Mac, then you can connect either via USB or Bluetooth. It comes with a little antenna that you can plug right into the back of the amp, and you can basically beam sounds that you make in bias amp straight into the amplifier, and off you go, which is cool because it sort of saves having a big bulky screen on the front of the thing, and instead you've got it in your phone, which I'm sure you're carrying with you anyways. Although the rack hosts a gaggle of amp editing features, I wanted to give you a really good idea of what the amp sounded like right out of the box. So all the sounds that you heard in the demo are straight off of the presets that come preloaded into the amp. If you want to increase the library of sounds that you have available to you, you can just go to the Bias Amp Tone Cloud and download sounds that other people have made. Some of these patches can even include the amp match feature of amps that you might want to be emulating that aren't available from Positive Grid. The first feature that we're going to look at is the ability to design an amp essentially from the ground up using the Bias Amp app. So the sound that you'll be hearing is me reamping a DI signal through the bias rack externally while I'm using the Bias Amp app to change all the settings. So I'm going to be starting with this stock Mark II C Plus sound that's just one of the presets on the rack. So I'm going to start the reamp so you can hear all the changes that I make as they go past. So we start with this, the front panel here that just gives you all the basic controls. Now, of course, you can just, change them like you would a normal amp. But now if we want to go a little deeper, we'll start from left to right here. Take a look at the preamp. We can change a bunch of stuff in the preamp. Most notably, the type of vacuum tube that we're looking at. So stock, this one comes with 12 AX7s, which are the highest gain tubes that exist as far as I know. But we could go down to a 12AU7, which has a lot less gain, slightly different sound. 12AT7, somewhere in the middle, or back to 12AX7s, which have a lot of gain. So you can bias the tubes cold or hot to varying degrees. Now at this point, we can drop in one of two different types of EQs. A parametric EQ or this sort of Mesa style EQ. Now onto the tone stack. You can drastically change the sound of the amp just by changing the type of tone stack you're looking at here. When it comes to the power amp, we've got a couple different options. Right now we're on the standard one. Let's try changing to a crunch style power amp. We can pick our power tubes. Right now they're 6L6s in kind of a Marshall style power amp. So change this to 6V6s, a little warmer. EL34s, a lot of mid-range. Not as much bottom end as the 6L6s. And 84s, which I think sound a little thin. But once again, we have a bias adjustment. Damping control. Vintage or modern style presence. Modern seems to have just more. The modern picks up where the vintage leaves off. And of course, you can do that same thing for any of these other style power amps. So the transformer is a very important part of any amp, but it's a little more subtle than some of these other controls. You've got three choices: American, British, or fat style. It seems like ways that you could order your In-N-Out burger. I'll have my double fat style or British style. British style would probably just have a bunch of onions on it. And American style probably has bacon. You can't get bacon in In-N-Out. That's a lot. Second to lastly, but certainly not at all least. In fact, I consider this to be almost the most important part of the signal chain, and that is the cab. So in this case, we're using one of the stock cabs, of which there are a slew. And if that wasn't enough, you can actually pick a different kind of mic and move them around on several different axes. We've also got a final EQ. And this is also where the amp match feature goes if that's something that you want to use. We're going to go through the amp match in a minute here, so I'm not going to pull one of those in just yet. So as you can see, this gives you a ton of options for adjusting the sound of your amp inside of the bias rack. You can save any of these patches to the different slots that you have on the amp, and then you can recall them with a foot switch. So one of the coolest and most important features of the bias rack is the ability to match an amp sound using the amp match feature, which you can do through the bias amp software and then load the patch into the bias rack. Right now I'm using the 2 Notes Torpedo Reload, and we're gonna amp match channel 4 of my Rev Generator 120. I'm not gonna go too in-depth on this portion of the review because there are a ton of tutorials out there on how to do this more in depth. I'm just gonna show you kind of how easy it is if you're set up to record like I am. So the basic gist of how we're doing this is I've got this rhythm guitar DI recorded. It's going out line 3, which is going into the torpedo, which is then going into the rev. The rev is going back into the torpedo direct from the power amp, and that I'm using that as a load box, and then we're getting the signal from that back into Pro Tools. That's coming in here on this track that says rev, and we're just using a Carbon Legacy cab, number 1 from Rosen Digital. What I'm gonna do first is I'm gonna record that sound, thusly. We're gonna take this sound and we're gonna sort of capture its soul using the amp match feature. I just use a 5153 amp. It's kind of close to the rev. You got to find something that's as close as you can get it. We're going to go to the cab section, and I'm going to pull up the IR loader. Okay, so we're going to pull up the same one as we've got, Carvin Legacy. Now, of course, you can use stock cabs. I just happen to be able to load in the same one that I'm using. Now that we've captured the sound of the rev, which is the sound that we're trying to get to, we have to take the first step in the amp match process, which is to capture the sound of the source, which is the amp that we already have, which is this one, this 5150. So I'm going to send this DI signal through bias amp, and it's going to listen to the sound that's coming through, and it's going to sample that, and then we move on to the next step. So as you can see, it says sampling source, and it has a percentage, so you just let it run until it's done. So now we're going to sample the sound of the rev, which is our target amp. So we go to the target portion, I'm going to hit play, and then hit sample. Same deal as before, we just let it run. So then the final step is just to listen to it and see how we did. Now here's just the rev. So I'm going to save it as rev amp match, and there we go. So now you can easily import it into the bias rack using the bias amp standalone software. And if you've saved it in here, it's already in the standalone software. When you pull it up, you'll be able to just load it, open it into the bias rack, and then save it in there. We live in a world of interconnectivity and social media, and the bias rack is set up so that you can share patches that you've made with other people and download ones that other people have made extremely easily using this thing called the Tone Cloud. Through the Tone Cloud, you have access to thousands of patches that have been made by users around the globe. They're organized by a couple different categories, and you can just click on one, download it, and hear it pretty much immediately. So I'll show you how that works. So now let's go download some tones of our own from other people. So the popular category is a great place to look. It's more likely that they're going to be good. Let's get one from my boy Fluff. Let's see what Fluff's got here. So this is an amp match of the channel 3 on the extreme setting of a Mesa Boogie Mark V. So that sounds like something I would like. Let's go ahead and download it. We can download it straight onto the rack. Now in order to hear this sound, all we have to do is either on the front panel of the amp, just select it using the knob, or we could go over here in the app and head over to metal and then click on the amp, and it'll load it right up right into the amp. Since we're already set up to reamp, just go ahead and hit record. And there you have it. One of the advantages that the bias rack has over some of the other modelers in the game is that you can connect to it with a mobile app over Bluetooth. So now I'm going to show you how I use my iPad Mini 2 that I let them upsell me on at the AT&T store to connect the bias amp app to the bias rack and use it to control it. Make sure that Bluetooth is enabled on your device, and then we're going to go to this little gear, and there's a connect button, and it should be as simple as that. Let's see how long it takes. And it is initializing now. Connected, boom, just like that. Crazy quick. And just like that, we're off. So what we have here is like a menu of amps. Right now, obviously, I'm sitting here in the studio. It would be just as easy to connect to the desktop app. But I want you to imagine that I'm sitting at a gig and the tone I've been using maybe hasn't been working. So I want to pick something new. So let's say I've been using this triple tread plate here. Sounds pretty good. Let's say it's a little too flubby for my taste. Let's check out this Mark V sound from Fluff instead. I think it needs a little more presence. There we go. Just right. That's really kind of absurd that you can do this just from an app. I think that's really cool. So as you can see, what the bias rack lacks in a built-in screen of any kind, it makes up for by connecting via Bluetooth to a device of pretty much any size. That, in my opinion, is pretty great, although, of course, that's something you have to already have or purchase separately. So if your device has Wi-Fi or it's connected to the internet any other way, you can connect right to the Tone Cloud just like on the desktop, and you can download any amp you like straight to the amp. All right, guys, thanks so much for checking out my review of the Bias Rack. For more information on the rack or to pick one up for yourself, head over to positivegrid.com. If you haven't already, please subscribe for more reviews and original content, and I'll see you real soon.